introduce Karl, who is an acknowledged expert in this area. He's a thought leader and an internationally established governance consultant who works with boards and senior executives across all sectors and internationally. And he's also the creator of the Board Effectiveness member programs, which have been delivered globally in partnership with leading organisations, including PricewaterhouseCoopers. He's recently launched a race code that we're very happy to support, and he's going to share some of the details with that and how it connects to the big promise. So Dr. Karl, let's get tingly about corporate governance.
Raj, I'm in that space. Thank you very much for that introduction. And yes, let's get talking about corporate governance and where my lived experience, Raj, has collided with my professional background. And I say that to say that as a teenager back in the 80s, I remember our relationship with the police, which wasn't the best, getting stopped all the time. And then in 2005, when now I'm planning to do a peace march to make sure my community in Birmingham doesn't kill itself, kill each other, Black and Asian community. And then in 2011, having a similar conversation with my teenage son that I was having when I was a teenager 30 years before, 20 odd years before. And our communities, and you know all the statistics about Black, so we're not going to cover them here today, that we've at the bottom of nearly every statistic. And we could release £24 billion, according to McGregor Smith, if we got the workforce and workplace inequalities sorted. We know about the McKinsey reports as well, about diversity, not just with gender, but also with ethnic diversity, very recently published. So what I decided to do is, and just over the summer, we had Rare, who you featured earlier, produce an excellent race fairness commitment, a number of standards there. We saw Business in the Community with their Black Voices report in August, produce another half a dozen to add to the half a dozen before. And very recently in Black History Month, we saw the CBI launch their Race at Work Charter, and we saw the footballers launch their Football Association Leadership Code. And what I'm saying is, almost 200 recommendations coming out of all these reports, and we've got to find something to make a change. We've got to find something to make a change. And this is why I came in. I said I wanted something different. Now, there's nothing wrong with the charters and pledges. And if you remember, you collaborated with me, Raj, on the Diversity in the Boardroom pledge. We got hundreds of organizations to pledge towards diversity in the boardroom. And my focus has been the workforce and the workplace. Let me have a look at what all of those recommendations say. But as you know, in Bob Garrett's great book, The Fish Rots from the Head, we've got to get the leadership right. And that's where I started. I said, let's try and find a governance solution, an accountability framework with a systemic, business-led approach to tackling representation in the boardroom and senior leadership team. Not in competition with any of those codes and pledges, but they're just a starting point. They're just somewhere that you use as part of the solution. I don't think they can be the solution. And these 4 key principles, I ask organizations to apply and then explain. This is something that King 4 in South Africa uses as a governance code, which says you don't have a tick box approach. You apply and you explain why you're applying. And then I've got 55, yes, I did say that, 55 must, shoulds and coulds, 10 must do's, and then some shoulds, and then finally some coulds, where we learn from best practice. So what I've done is try to make sure that we ensure that all the great work that's been done before, we don't throw it out the window, but we don't need to do it again. We don't need to do any more reports. We don't need to find any more interventions, because we have got the solutions. What we haven't got, in my opinion, is an accountability framework. And those mathematicians amongst you, because we can learn from the res, for example. That's what they do in the NHS. We can learn from the government McGregor-Smith sponsored report with the 26 recommendations there, or the Parker review in the private sector, or business in the community. We can learn from all of those. If you add them up, it doesn't come to exactly 55, because some of them have been combined and some of them we've brought together. And as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, we've also looked at the CBI, change the race ratio, and so on and so forth. A robust framework using accountants and solicitors and people who get tingly, like me, about corporate governance to make sure there's a robust methodology, and then a focus group of which I'll share with you in a minute, and some early adopters. And forgive the West Midlands focus to it. I happen to be here in Birmingham, and some of you might just detect a slight accent sometimes. So we've got the local authority here, the West Midlands Combined Authority, the Chambers of Commerce, and a number of large organisations, housing, NHS Trust, nationally, that are adopting the code and helping us to define the must, should and could. And some people who have been on the steering group to help us to get it this far, previous chair of the IOD, Charlotte Villor, for example, academics, deputy chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and some of the people who have been stalwarts in getting there, Gary Eldon, Yvonne Colgill from Workforce Race Equality Standard, and so on. So what are these 4 principles? Let me just simplify it by saying that, number 1, we're saying, and we've said it in the start over this period, let's talk about race. I know sometimes people think it's that uncomfortable conversation, but I'm saying we need to report on it, and we need to report on it in a public domain way, like we do with other key governance issues. In your annual report, on your website and employment forums, let's specifically talk about race, not to the detriment of any other area. In fact, targeted universalism says if we get one area right, then it actually impacts all other areas positively. Let's be accountable, and let's make sure that we're reporting at the highest level in an organisation about the must, shoulds and coulds that I mentioned. And then let's get to the data. There's been a lot of talk about BAME and the Black separate from the Asian, and in the Asian separating sometimes Sikh from another cultural ethnic group, because the data means that we each have different idiosyncrasies and the systems treat us differently. So we need to find out, when we're talking about tracking our way through the senior leadership team and in the boardroom, I can give you some statistics about Black, which means we're nowhere to be seen sometimes. We need to get to that data. And then finally, it's about education. How can we make sure we are educating effectively? And there's been a lot of talk, even in the chat room today, about things like critical race theory, about white fragility, about white privilege, about unconscious bias training, safe places and courageous conversations. I could go on and on and on. So there it is. The vision is to create a governance code, a governance solution to something that needs to be tackled at the highest level in an organization and strategically. Very simple to follow, but difficult to implement. You can't just sign this and then you're in. You've got to do some hard work, just like you do with governance codes generally. I'm saying here as I finish off that if you're not part of the solution, unfortunately, my opinion, you're part of the problem. And I'll be having these same conversations with my grandchildren. Hope that's a long way to go, by the way. But I'll be having those same conversations with my grandchildren that I was having with my teenage son. And when Raj called me about Race Equality Week, Race Equality Matters, and the Big Promise, I've helped to contribute to the Big Promise and Magnificent Seven from the board perspective. And I believe that where action is required now, and we can get together that first week in February to share, to make sure there's resources there, to educate, and then make people accountable. I think it's a no-brainer in terms of a technical comment, it's a no-brainer. We need to get together around race. So I conclude there. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak on another of your launch events. And I'm getting even more passionate, so I better stop here, and even more tingly and hand back over to you.